Okay, so first off, the Gauntlet is an event hosted by Zizzer in every league. It's usually at the start of the second month of the league, and it is based in SSF hardcore, so it is hardcore. So if you do die, you end up having to restart. And it challenges players to defeat all of the bosses as fast as possible, and it adds in the new bosses this time around with the Uber bosses, with Uber Syrian Exarch, Uber Eater of Worlds, Uber Awakener, and then there's also the Feared. So there's a bunch of different bosses that are added. Now, the main difference in this Gauntlet is that the difficulty scales based off of what zone you are in. So if you see here, there's different modifiers for Acts 1 through 5, Acts 6 through 10, white maps, yellow maps, and red maps, with the mod scaling to 35% less damage taken at monster level 85 plus, 20% increased attack, cast, and move speed, 40% increased damage, 30% increased AoE, and 2 additional projectiles. Now, for people wondering how this compares to last Gauntlet, it is markedly easier. 35% less damage taken is like 54% more monster life compared to 100% more monster life or unique monster life last Gauntlet. 20% increased attack, cast, and move speed is 20% less. Last time around, it was 40% haste. And 40% increased damage, and I do think that this is the biggest thing, is that 40% increased damage is miles less than 100% increased damage. So it will make builds not need to be as tanky to kill the bosses, and 30% increased AoE compared to 100% is a huge difference, and 2 additional projectiles instead of 4 additional projectiles is also a massive difference. Now keep in mind that last time around there was no Uber bosses, so a lot of these fights are already LMP, say like Maven or Shaper, so having 4 additional projectiles will pretty much just be completely overkill. So what this means is that the campaign is a lot easier for a lot of new players. You don't have to deal with some absurd amounts of haste or absurd amounts of damage or die into LMP Weaver, because right now it's only 1 additional projectile, so Weaver should probably be the easiest it has ever been. And I do think a lot of people enjoy the campaign a lot more, and it won't feel like such a torture fest while you're doing it. And something interesting to note is that mapping will be a little bit more annoying in terms of monster life, because in the past, or the last Gauntlet, there's no monster HP. So right now on yellow, red, and white maps, you'll actually be doing 30% less damage to white mobs and rare mobs, and blue mobs. Not like it's too big of a deal, but that's just something to keep in mind. But let's go straight into the top builds for the Gauntlet. So these builds are pretty much done in the order that I think the best, the worst to best. So number 3, we have Spectral Helix and LS Champion. Now, the big thing about this build is this is probably the best build once you farm up all the gear. However, this Gauntlet is way too easy to allow anyone the time to farm all the gear. The only hope you have if you do decide to play this build is you're only going to be focusing on winning the champion or duelist class. And even if you farm the entire duration of the Gauntlet, it is very, very likely still that you do not get an Omni and Perseverance. If you did invitations at a rate of 30 minutes per invitation and farming it, I think there's still like a 20% chance that you don't get it or something like that. But if you're able to farm it, the build is extremely tanky because you get Fortified, you have 70 to 100k armor and evasion. And if you do somehow a miracle also farm Melting, and you have 90% resist, and it's easy to get 90 res because you do have Omni giving you a bunch of all res. And then you also have Elusive Effect, which is just chance to avoid all damage at 30 to 40% effect. So what this means is that the recovery of the build is also not too bad. You have a lot of life gain on hit with the claws, and you can also place down your banner or Defiance banner for like 5 to 6% life regen. Now, the problem with this build is it does require you to place Spectral Helix for leveling and gearing, and a lot of people do not like that. Spectral Helix is super annoying to play, and it is kind of annoying to play it during the campaign to level up. A lot of people struggle while doing Dodri boss fight or something like that. And it is kind of annoying, but I do think that it is the best option if you're going to play a duelist. And it's also the easiest way to level up still, even if Spectral Helix is not the best mechanically for map clearing. Now, the map clearing, if you do swap to Lightning Strike, is really, really fast. And this is because you have strike additional enemies. And I did try it out lastly in the Gauntlet with Lightning Strike and no Omni, and it was honestly fine. Now, I do think that this is the strongest build when fully geared up. but I do think that gearing will take too long. So barring a miracle where all of the top players who are playing Sabo dies, this is not going to be a build to get first place or super, super high placement if you do care about that. But in all honesty, this build is really fun to gear up, but the main problem is that Omni is almost impossible to get, as I think it is a 2% drop rate currently. And then if you want to get Melding, which is a 5% drop rate, you're looking at an impossible grind, and Perseverance is another big item. There's no guarantee that you get Perseverance, and Perseverance is a huge chunk of your damage. So there's a lot of different factors here and a lot of different grinds that you have to do. And you might just be stuck playing two-handed Impale Spectral Helix like Alkaiser did until the end of the event, until you finally can swap into Omni and Claws, and that could be a huge, huge problem. Now, next up, we have DD Necro, and DD Necro is a build that has very good consistent damage, and I do think that it is one of the tankiest options you have against a lot of hits. So if you're doing a fight, say like Shape Uber Shaper, and there's a lot of projectiles you have to dodge in the bullet health phase, having max block and spell block helps out a lot. It also helps out during the Searing Exarch Ball phase, I think. I'm not 100% sure. But the reason why this build does so well is because it takes advantage of a bug Spectre called Orc Colossus, and I think the Spectre has like 60% more monster life or Spectre life compared to other Spectres. And this is huge for DPS scaling. The build is very tanky. You have max block and spell block if you want to. Now, the difference between this build and the other builds is that instead of having 70 plus K armor and evasion, you have 20 to 30K armor and evasion with this setup. But 30K armor and evasion is honestly fine without the 100% increased monster damage like last time. You have the option to get 90 max res with Melding, purely because you can take Commander of Darkness for resist. And you do have the option to get a high hybrid HP/ES pool if you do decide to get Glorious Vanity and Doriani's. The gearing process is relatively straightforward. It's not as easy as Seismic. You do want to prioritize getting ailment effects, as you can see here. And these PoBs are pretty much just ripped off from people last league playing these builds of I'm Exile or Ben or something like that. So you can see here, for the Amulet, you want to get ailment effect. Boots, you also want to get ailment effect. And Helm, you also want to get ailment effect, I think, on your implicits. So a lot of it just comes down to scaling ailment effect to get more chill, shock, and scorch. And you need to get the scorch thing on your boots now, purely because if you see here, if you go to the config, you turn off Scorch Ground. Scorch Ground is a huge amount of your damage. Now, chill effect is super, super good in the Gauntlet or any dangerous boss scenario because it makes the boss's attacks a lot slower. So it pretty much negates the haste effect from the Gauntlet mods. Now, the damage uptime is pretty good on Ignite with like 3 mil DPS around there. However, 3 mil DPS is pretty underwhelming for a lot of the new Uber fights, especially when I think like the Uber, I don't even know how much HP the Uber bosses have, but it is an incredible amount of HP. And for some fights, like say Uber Searing Exarch or Uber Awakener or Cyrus, you will run into problems where the arena could be completely filled up with degens, and this build's recovery is not exactly the best thing in the world. I do think that most builds recovery will be solved by just running like 3 life blasts or something like that from what I see. But this is a pretty big problem, and I do think that it requires a little bit more gearing because you do need to squeeze out all the damage you can possibly get from this build. Because bossing a 2 to 3 mil DPS, as good as your gear could be, is very, very bad for Uber bosses. And I do think that this is one of the main reasons why DD Necro is not actually the #1 build. Now, something to note is that this build's tankiness does come from some RNG aspects in that you need block and spell block, so it's not exactly foolproof, and it is another build that you can't really farm Melding really deterministically as a 5% chance to drop, but this is probably something that's copium and that most people will not be able to pull off. And one last thing, DD Necro is not exactly the easiest build in the world to play in maps and also to play on boss fights. It does require you to desecrate the ground and then cast Detonate Dead and fish for corpses. And it also requires you to save your Vault Detonate Dead and focus. So it's not exactly the easiest build to play in the world, and it could allow you to mess up a lot on bossing. Now, next up, we have the build that's pretty much going to be the guaranteed winner, both because it is the best build in my opinion, and it's also being played by the best players. Now, Seismic is a build that will be played as Poison. You could technically go crit if you could farm up enough gear, but Poison is extremely good. There have been some new tech for Seismic, in that people use Blade Trap now to apply Withering Touch, which allows you to get 15 stacks of Wither pretty easily. And that makes a pretty big difference in the amount of damage. A lot of people do use Malevolence Life Tap tech now. So pretty much the build has even more damage than before, and it's going to be absolutely insane in terms of starting out. The build is actually pretty tanky. It gets one hit. It has Ghost Shrouds, and this node here is very strong in that it gives you 15% reduced damage taken from blinded enemies. So it's like 75% of the effect of what's it called, Champion Fortify for enemies that are blinded and nearby. And you do have 30k plus armor and evasion, so this build does have the ability to get 30k plus armor. And evasion is not as much as the champion, but it's pretty much the same as the Necro. And it has 15% DR instead of the block and spell block that Necros actually have. And there's not very many RNG aspects for gearing, and you don't really need to get a bunch of ailment effect everywhere. So gearing is pretty much just life and suppression. There is some RNG for getting Deer Stalkers, which is kind of annoying, but you probably will get it by the time you have the boss. Coda Shrapnel is something that is not required, but will help out the skill tree a little bit. And if you do decide to go clusters for damage, that might be some RNG aspect in terms of farming. But it has great damage uptime because of how poison functions and because of how Seismic scales. Seismic Trap is one of these skills that have incredible scaling because it scales with duration, it scales with AoE. So it allows you to scale your skill in multiple ways, and duration scaling also scales your poison duration, allowing you to pretty much just put your traps down and run around and focus on dodging. And Malevolence further increases the duration and gives you ailment damage in terms of how much the poison damage will deal. Now, this damage is a lot better than DD Necro. I think some people say it's like 2 to 3 times more damage or DPS than DD Necro, or even more, and it allows you to rush bosses faster. I do think that DD Necro progresses the fastest through the campaign, but Seismic will allow you to kill the bosses the fastest because your damage will be high enough and you don't need to farm as much gear as a Necro or the Champion Lightning Strike build requires. So Seismic Sabo is by far the best build, and I do think that it will be the winner for Gauntlet. So I do think the builds are pretty much the exact same as last time, but this time around, we have the improved Atlas that you can block a bunch of league mechanics, and this makes a pretty big deal in that you can block for Harvest. You'll pretty much be getting a Harvest in almost every other map or so. And I do think that the clear will probably be done in 3 to 4 days, roughly, as long as Ben and Amexo don't die. Now, farming Melting, Omni, or Ashes this time around is pretty unreasonable because it's just not possible to do it reliably when the drop rate is 2 to 5% respectively. And another thing to consider is that the practice will pretty much be 1-1 this time, and it results in players being a lot more confident about how the boss fights will play out and progression will play out. Last time around, there's a lot less practice being done, purely because no one could really simulate 100% increased monster damage. But this time around, it's a lot easier to simulate because GGG already allows us to have 2 proj. It already allows us to have the more monster life, which is about equal to what the Gauntlet will provide this time. Now, EA was actually the most popular build last time, and I was pretty surprised when I looked through PoE Ninja. And 15% of players was actually playing Explosive Arrow. Seismic Trap was not as played because I think a lot of people were afraid that Seismic Trap was going to be too squishy with how hard the Gauntlet was last time. But this time, I'm pretty much sure that you're going to be seeing Seismic Trap at like 20+% or even more. And I really wonder if people will play Explosive Arrow again. I do think that Explosive Arrow's damage is pretty high and nuts. And it might be a lot better this time around without the mods being so hard. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And lastly, this build right here, I do think is the best build overall if time was not an issue and you could get all of the gear you farm, but that's just not realistic. Sabo is going to be the best overall build if you want to finish the Gauntlet as fast as possible. For most people, I pretty much just recommend you play whatever build is fun to play for you. A lot of people hate playing DD, a lot of people hate playing Seismic, a lot of people hate playing Spectral Helix. So if you do want to play this event, just play the build you hate playing the least. But thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you find more Mirrors, Exalts, and Mage Bloods than me, and see you next time. Bye!